On the 31st of July 1940, a gasoline-powered passenger rail car, commonly known as a Doodlebug, set off on a routine journey between Hudson and Akron, Ohio, with 46 people on board. 43 of them would never make it to their destination, losing their lives in what would turn out to be the most deadly train crash in the state for nearly 70 years. Gas engines were self-propelled railcars designed to carry either passengers or freight. Rather than drawing power from electrified rail lines, they were driven by gasoline-fueled engines. They became popular in the USA during the early 20th century, in particular on lightly used railroads. On these lines, they were much less expensive to run than a train, as they required less power and a smaller crew. Most Doodlebugs had a driver's cab at either end, allowing them to turn around quickly. They were sometimes used to pull a trailer car, but most often were deployed as a single self-contained unit. The public quickly started referring to gas engines as Doodlebugs, a name which arose from their beetle-like appearance, and which also referred to their relatively slow speed. They moved at such a sedate pace compared to the electric trains that they were said to doodle down the tracks. In the early days, Doodlebugs were powered by gasoline, and the biggest manufacturer of them was the Pullman Company. Doodlebugs were used on the Akron to Hudson line operated by Pennsylvania Railroad. This line was part of the much longer Columbus to Hudson route, which extended for over 228 kilometers, or 142 miles. Most of the tracks around Akron were double tracks, though at some points these narrowed down to a single track. At these points, measures would be put in place to prevent two trains travelling in opposite directions from being on the single-track section at the same time. Sometimes written orders would be left for the drivers, and sometimes there would be manned signal boxes that would direct the trains as they approached. The Akron to Hudson journey was around 21 kilometers or 13 miles, and was mainly used by commuters going to and from work. Passengers would travel from nearby Cleveland and Pittsburgh to Hudson, and then catch the Doodlebug into Akron for the last part of their journey. On the 31st of July 1940, engineer Thomas L. Murtaugh took charge of a gas-powered Doodlebug engine, something he had been doing regularly since April of that year. Though relatively new to driving a Doodlebug, he had 30 years of experience working on the railroad. Joining him was 57-year-old conductor Harry B. Schaefer, who had been filling in for an absent colleague for the last 10 days. Todd Wan, a 24-year-old rail worker, was also on board as a passenger, riding back to Akron after finishing some work in Hudson. When they arrived at the Hudson depot that evening, having just completed a trip from Akron, there were orders waiting for them. These told them that a freight train was scheduled to travel down the same line as them, coming in the opposite direction. As such, the Doodlebug was to wait at Switch 1 at Silver Lake until the freight train had passed. The freight train was traveling from Columbus to Cleveland with 73 fully loaded cars in tow. It stopped on the way at Arlington in Akron, where the crew were given corresponding written orders, telling them how and where to safely pass the Doodlebug. Back with the Doodlebug, it was conductor Schaefer who first physically picked up the orders from the Hudson depot. He personally delivered them to engineer Murtaugh, and would later recall saying as he did so, "We meet at Switch 1, Silver Lake." Murtaugh acknowledged this utterance while also reading over the written orders for himself. The Doodlebug departed Hudson at 5:49 p.m., at roughly the same time as the freight train left Akron. During the first part of the journey, conductor Schaefer made his way through the train to check tickets, before making his way to the smoking section to complete some clerical duties. When he had finished these duties, he checked the time, and noticed that it was a few seconds past when the Doodlebug should have stopped at the switch at Silver Lake. Realizing that something was wrong, he headed for the control room to speak to Murtaugh. Before he could get there, he spotted the freight train on the single track up ahead. At the exact same moment, engineer Murtaugh, also spotting the freight train, slammed on the emergency brakes. The engineer on board the freight train did the same while also sounding the whistle. Conductor Schaefer, at this point, was standing close to off-duty rail worker Todd 1 and yelled at him that they were about to crash. The two of them leapt from the Doodlebug. Realizing that a crash was inevitable, Murtaugh also threw himself from the control room. At 5:58 p.m. at Cuyahoga Falls, the freight train, still traveling at around 40 km per hour or 25 miles per hour, smashed into the Doodlebug, destroying the front control room and ploughing 3.6 meters or 12 feet into the passenger compartment. In doing so, it punctured the fuel tank of the Doodlebug, spilling a huge quantity of gasoline. This ignited, and a huge ball of fire engulfed the Doodlebug. The fire spread to the freight train, where it burned the face of the engineer, who later recalled, "When we hit, there was a terrific explosion. The fireman and I stayed with her through the fire and explosion until she came to a stop. Then we jumped through a wall of flame." Still moving, the freight train forced the burning Doodlebug back along the track around 150 meters, or 500 feet, towards a road. Local residents poured out of their homes to try and help, but quickly realized that they couldn't get anywhere near the wreckage, as the heat and smoke were too overpowering. As local fire chief L.P. Seller later recalled, "I was there 2 minutes after the wreck, and the Doodlebug was already a furnace." It would take 45 minutes to put out the fire, by which time any hope that there would be survivors had also been extinguished. It took several hours to remove all of the bodies from the wreckage, as many had been fused to the seats by the heat of the fire. Every seat had been torn from its base, and they had piled up at the rear of the car. Some of the passengers had been burned to the extent that identification was almost impossible. All 43 passengers of the Doodlebug lost their lives. Engineer Murtaugh was found around 300 meters or 1,000 feet from the accident site. He had suffered a skull fracture and was in a confused state. Conductor Harry Schaefer had to have his right hand and leg amputated, while off-duty rail worker Todd 1 suffered only a sprained ankle and minor burns. His roommate had also been on the Doodlebug, however, and had perished in the crash. Within just 24 hours of the disaster, the vice president of Pennsylvania Railroad had issued a statement to say that the crew had failed to obey orders, and that this was what had caused the crash. Not everyone agreed with this assessment. The Brotherhood of Railway Trainmen, a labor organization for railroad employees, argued that there were once 3 signalmen stationed on the line between Hudson and Akron, but they had all been removed as part of cost-cutting measures. Regarding this, they said, "We've maintained that it's not the business of an engineer or a conductor to do the work of an operator." 3 separate investigations were launched to try to understand the reason for the crash, but all inquiries were hampered by the fact that it took engineer Thomas Murtaugh some time to recover from his injuries. He suffered from delusions while he was in hospital, repeatedly saying, "Get me out of here. I've got to get back to work." The investigations recovered a copy of the orders for the Doodlebug, which clearly said to wait at switch 1. There was no doubt that they had been received, so why had Engineer Murtaugh not stopped the Doodlebug at the switch? When Engineer Murtaugh was finally able to give evidence to the coroner, he confirmed that he had received and understood the orders, but couldn't remember the minutes leading up to the arrival of the Doodlebug at the switch. His memory was a complete blank until the moment that he saw the freight train approaching. Murtaugh, it was found, had previously experienced headaches and a loss of appetite while driving the Doodlebug, and he had lost 6.8 kilograms, or 15 pounds, of body weight since he had started work on that line. This led investigators to suggest that he may have experienced carbon monoxide poisoning from gasoline fumes while in the cab, which had caused him to become temporarily impaired. In the end, no charges were held against the crew or the rail company. The families of the dead filed lawsuits against Pennsylvania Railroad, who settled out of court, paying out nearly $600,000. New signals and an interlocking safety system were installed around Silver Lake, while all the gasoline engines of the Doodlebugs were replaced with less flammable diesel ones. Exactly 11 years after the tragedy, on July 31st, 1951, the Doodlebug ran from Hudson to Akron for the last time, and the route was discontinued. The use of gasoline engines on trains declined steadily thereafter, though diesel-powered trains are still in use in many parts of the world. Though devastating at the time, the Doodlebug disaster was largely forgotten by history. In 2005, a school project by 13-year-old students at Sill Middle School in Ohio triggered a campaign to raise funds to construct a memorial. This was built close to the site of the crash on the 65th anniversary of the Doodlebug disaster.